Following the end of the Vietnam War in April 1975, thousands of Vietnamese people risked their lives to flee from the communist regime. Many escaped by boat and were later referred to as the boat people. These people went on a journey filled with tragedy and hardship, and thousands had died along the journey. Those that survived sought temporary refuge in neighboring countries. Eventually, the boat people were taken in by the developed countries such as the United States. Despite the overwhelming obstacles, the boat people have triumphed. Today, the Vietnamese have become strong contributors to their community. In the spring of April 1975, Communist North Vietnam seized Saigon, marking the end of the Vietnam War. Tanks rolled through the streets of the southern capital. The South ended up falling under communist rule. The Vietnam War had broken out between North and South Vietnam in 1965. During the war, the United States had allied the South. But early in 1973, the United States finally came to terms with North Vietnam and signed what was called an Agreement on Ending the War and Restoring the Peace in Vietnam. Thus, the South surrendered to the North and the communist government took over. The war had brought destruction throughout Vietnam, and many were killed, injured, or left homeless. Once the communist North had taken over South Vietnam, they began to imprison those who supported the South during the war. Despite the creation of a United Republic of Vietnam in 1975, many in the South feared retribution once it was found that they had fought against the North during the actual war. Freedom became restricted, religious practices were forbidden, and human rights were violated. Land and property were also taken away. The living conditions grew harsh and worsened. These all led to an increase in poverty among the Vietnamese. Thus, thousands left their homes behind in search of freedom and better life. Parents in Vietnam would send their children to leave the country with only the hope that they would survive. Some left at a very young age, often alone with other Vietnamese people. Many took the drastic decision to leave the country, an illegal act under the communist rule. More than 840,000 Vietnamese asylum seekers left the communist regime and arrived in the countries of Southeast Asia and Hong Kong. Many had fled on small fishing boats, which would consist of over 20 people, and it was often overcrowded.
I escaped Vietnam by boat. I was in a small boat and hoped only can be survived 50%. It was really scary for me because at that time it was stormy. The waves brought the boat up and down.
The journey out at sea was treacherous. During the journey, the boat people faced countless of obstacles, huge storms, pirates, thirst, and starvation. There would be stories of engines breaking out on the first day at sea. The boat people could only hope that the waves would push them to a neighboring country. While out at sea, the boat people encountered Thai pirates who robbed the Vietnamese of their possessions. When captured, the men and women would be separated from each other. A Vietnamese boat person, Hoa, recalls that it was a chronicle of repeated attacks, robbery, torture, rape, and murder at the hands of Thai pirates.
The journey to get out from Vietnam, very trying, very painful, and very scary, I would say. Right at the moment we got out, and our boat was terrorized by the sea pirate, I believe that Thai fishermen took over the boat many times and assault women, young children, that I couldn't imagine that how dare that those people that treat the boat people in that way.
Many were able to successfully seek asylum in the neighboring countries, but countless had died out at sea. While out at sea, some boats were lucky enough to be discovered by boats from neighboring countries that took the Vietnamese in. Yet, there were those who did not survive because their boats would sink. The boat people who were able to safely land in the neighboring countries stayed in refugee camps, but would eventually leave and be taken into the bigger developing countries like the United States, Canada, Australia, and France. The Vietnamese would stay in the camps for months or even years, but living conditions in the camps were not ideal. Eventually, they settled in the United States and Europe. The Vietnamese were overcome with many difficulties. Leaving their homeland had been tragic and risky, but later they had to learn to adjust with their arrival in a foreign country. Adapting to a new cultural environment and learning a new language took a lot of time and patience, along with creating an economic standing for oneself. Despite the many difficulties, the Vietnamese refugees had created an immediate presence for themselves upon arrival in the new communities. In the United States, the Vietnamese immediately built communities that grew immensely and prospered. In Santa Clara County, their impacts were profound and immediate. In the physical environment, workplace, schools, and the economy, where the incomes earned by the Vietnamese and the taxes they paid far exceeded the welfare given to people in their group. The journey of the boat people had started out as a search for freedom, to escape from the communist government's persecution. The boat people had embarked on a frightening and terrifying journey out at sea, not knowing whether they would survive or not. To stay was to not have a future living in freedom. Fleeing was the only option if they wanted to live. It had been a very risky decision, and many had died out at sea, but those who survived are still living to tell their story. Vietnamese Americans fought for America. They also struggled to carve out their own space in this country. They built their own Vietnam War Memorial in Orange County, California, home of Little Saigon, the largest Vietnamese community in America. Today, the boat people are one of the biggest racial communities that exists in the United States. From being medical doctors to a dentist or lawyer, these people have created their own stable standings in their communities. Never before in American history has such a large block of people faced with such overwhelming obstacles succeeded so fast in turning around their lives to become economically self-sufficient contributors to the community in which they lived. The stories that each individual boat person holds displays the huge amount of courage they had to risk their lives in order to be free. Continuing till our present day, the Vietnamese boat people have become strong contributing members of society, which was all thanks to the opportunities that opened to them.